of the big points that Eric and I made in our extended paper was that we failed in our efforts to measure PCK. And so I'm going to start by describing our failure and then move on to kind of some bigger issues for, I think, the field. So the structure is similar to SUNY, so talking about our work and then zooming out to field issues. I also want to acknowledge at the beginning that I have a quantitative measurement orientation. So when I talk about instruments, I'm thinking about quantitative measurement instruments as opposed to descriptive or characterization kinds of instruments, okay? So how we fail. You may remember from our extended paper this diagram which shows this ball that has equal and opposite forces acting on it so that they all cancel each other out. And the idea that we wanted teachers and students to, teachers to grapple with here is that this ball could be at rest or it could be moving at constant speed. Okay. So we presented teachers with a prompt that said, imagine a teacher has shown this diagram to the students and asked them to write something about the forces and the motion of the ball. And the students, most of them write something like this. Since the net force acting on the ball is 0, it must not be moving. So, and then of the following strategies, which would be best for moving the students forward? So the students clearly have something less than what we would consider full understanding of this idea. And the question is, how do you move them forward? So we gave the teachers these options. One, have them discuss an activity that they had done recently that gets at this idea. 2, create a new hands-on experiment that gets at this idea. 3, have students read something in their textbook that explains this idea. And then we had a fourth option. This is a multiple choice test. We had a fourth option that allows the teachers to think that the students are just fine and just move on. Okay? Now, you may be asking yourself right now, what were they thinking when they tried to measure PCK this way? And that's a legitimate question. I'm sure you probably figured it out by now. You could argue that A through C are all correct. Okay? As Sophie said yesterday, you could ask a physics educator what they would do, and they might come up with either one of these to be able to justify it. So where we landed on this was that when PCK is not authoritative or canonical or whatever, or indispensable, whatever you want to use, you can't measure it in a multiple choice. We couldn't measure it in a multiple choice format. Now, the reason we wanted to try was because if we could pull it off, then we would be able to measure PCK of large numbers of teachers economically. And that was important for a study that we were engaged in at that time, which was looking at teacher knowledge in relation to teacher practice in relation to student outcomes. So that's how we failed. But this led us to an approach to measuring teacher subject matter knowledge that we think we had more success with. And the structure looks similar, where we give teachers a prompt, set up a classroom situation. This one happens to be in the context of plate tectonics. So during a class discussion, the student says there are thousands of plates that are moving and causing the Earth's surface to change. Based on this statement, what should the teacher do next? Now, I don't know if everybody's familiar with plate tectonics, but geologists typically agree that there are somewhere between 10 and 20 plates, but not thousands. Okay. So this student clearly, again, has an issue, and the question is what to do next. So we asked the teachers to consider these 4 options, and I'll just give you a second to read those to yourself. So, all 4 of these are fine things to do in a unit on plate tectonics. That's not the issue. The point is that only one of them, we think, aligns with the statement that the student has made. Okay? So if a teacher knows the content, that there are not thousands of plates, that's really all a teacher needs to know to be able to pick the right answer. Because it's forced choice, it's not open-ended. So in our opinion, this item, although it's set in an instructional context, it's measuring subject matter knowledge. It's not measuring PCK. We would love to be convinced otherwise, but we haven't been able to do that. So that's our work. What I'd like to do now is kind of zoom out and talk about developing instruments more broadly. And again, I have in mind measurement instruments, quantitative instruments. In our group yesterday, somebody said that our PCK measurements are in their infancy. And I agree, and what I'd like to try to do is explain why I think that's true. About 10 years ago, Jim Pellegrino and NRC wrote a book called Knowing What Students Know, which was essentially a handbook for developing assessments. And in that book, they presented this idea of an assessment triangle. And the triangle, like all triangles, has three vertices. And the three vertices are a theory of cognition, a way of observing teachers' knowledge, and then interpretation. So the theory of cognition is about how individuals represent knowledge and how competency develops. Observations are how we observe that knowledge, whether it's through surveys, interviews, observations, so on. And then interpretation is what kinds of claims do we want to make from the observations? What kinds of claims or inferences? Pellegrino's point was that to develop a valid assessment, you have to have all three of these components and they have to be aligned with each other. And I guess what I want to argue is that the reason our instruments are in their infancy is that we have not reached consensus on any one of these 3 points. So to go into that in a little more detail, claims, we've talked a lot about the last 2 days about what kinds of things we want to say from our PCK instruments. One of the things that I've heard a lot is claims about an individual teacher's mastery or expertise or competence with PCK. But there are other kinds of claims we might make too, like claims about just the amount of PCK an individual has, regardless of their mastery, claims about the impact of some experience on PCK, or claims about needs for professional development, or others. But the point that I think the triangle makes is that your theory of cognition might depend on what kinds of claims, well, it does depend on what kinds of claims you want to make. And you may have more or less work to do developing a theory depending on the kind of claim you want to make. So for instance, if all I care about is saying something about how much PCK a teacher has, then if I just specify the PCK domain for a topic and how a teacher would represent that knowledge, that might be enough to develop an assessment. But on the other hand, if I want to make a claim about expertise or mastery, I also have to have a theory that encompasses how competence develops in that domain. And that's a much more difficult task. Something like a learning progression, which Becky's written about, and I think you're going to talk about tomorrow, but it would be topic specific, I think. And then finally, observations. There's been lots of discussion the last 2 days about what do we have to look at in order to decide or characterize a teacher's PCK. Do we have to go into the classroom? Can we get it through interviews, through written responses, through artifacts? But I think the reason that we don't agree yet is because we don't have a fully formed theory of cognition of what PCK is and how teachers represent it. So going forward, I think 2 big challenges. One, we're still coming to consensus on the definition of PCK, although I feel like in the last 2 days we've made a huge amount of progress, at least in my own thinking. I feel like I have. But that's before a theory of cognition. Secondly, if we agree that PCK is topic specific, then a theory of cognition also has to be topic specific. So the last question we were asked to consider was this idea of would having uniformity and consistency advance our individual collective efforts? And that left me with really two thoughts. One is, if PCK is topic specific, then the notion of developing measures seems daunting. If we have to do all this work of the triangle for every single topic, it seems almost impossible. So the other thought I had was that we need a research agenda that acknowledges that and deploys our assessment development resources strategically. And rather than saying we need an assessment for every topic, pick some topics that allow us to do the research we want to do, need to do, and be able to make the claims we want to be able to make about PCK. That's it. That's it.